Macho Prieto. Gonzalo Insunza was known as Macho Prieto. He was a feared narco known to shoot first and ask questions later. A native of Sinaloa, he was known throughout the narco industry, a successful trafficker with his own independent network of sicarios and smugglers. He was also a member of the feared Sinaloa cartel. He occupied the role of plaza chief of several key cities. One of the most important plazas he controlled was the city of Mexicali, located in the northern state of Baja California. He also operated in the state of Sonora. The city of Puerto Peñasco was his home base. Macho was an effective enforcer, but he was also erratic when under the influence. By December 2013, his enemies within his own cartel had convinced the higher-ups that he was now more of a liability. On the night of December 17, 2013, federal police were alerted to a convoy speeding towards the seaside resort city of Puerto Peñasco. A quick reaction force was assembled. It included Black Hawk helicopters and a platoon of Marines. When the Macho ran into the surprise security check on the highway, a gun battle erupted. Macho sicarios were loaded with plenty of ammo and heavy weapons. They emptied magazine after magazine at the officers and Marines. Macho and his sicarios were close to his luxury condo in a nearby tower. Two sicarios opened up on one of the helicopters, while the rest of the group made their way into the building. The two sicarios, meanwhile, were only able to get off a couple of rounds before the Black Hawk opened up on them with a minigun. The group reached the condo, where they had more weapons and ammo stored. For hours, both sides traded fire. Terrified residents of nearby apartment towers began to evacuate the area. Police helped get people to safety as the battle raged on. Macho realized he needed help. He picked up a phone and began to frantically dial. He called on one of his security chiefs to rush over and help him push back the cops and Marines. Within minutes, his loyal sicarios were loading up with bulletproof vests and weapons. They sped towards the boss with the goal of opening up an escape route. Then right before the reinforcements arrived and Macho was shot in the leg, he slumped down and was losing a lot of blood. Then finally, when things looked grim, his reinforcements arrived. They began to throw grenades and even used a grenade launcher against the surrounding officers. Macho's gunmen quickly picked him up and made their way toward a waiting SUV, which immediately sped away together with his surviving gunmen. They were able to get away and take their boss with them. However, Macho had been wounded badly. As stated in a past video, there are two theories as to what happened next to Macho. Some say he was put on a private jet, but on his way to safety, he died of his injuries. Another theory claims he made it back to Sinaloa and managed to survive his wounds, although he was now unable to walk and was confined to a wheelchair. However, he still had to answer to the cartel for the wrongs he had committed in the past against some of his fellow traffickers. He supposedly retired from the narco industry and decided to live out the rest of his days at a ranch he bought near the mountains somewhere in the Golden Triangle. Soon after, a Sinaloa hit team arrived and killed him. But whichever version is the truth, that night in December 2013 would be remembered as one of the biggest shootouts in modern Mexican history. El Macho's gunmen were known as an aggressive force, but that night they took some heavy losses. In total, 5 sicarios lost their lives that night. The nearby highway was littered with several burned out SUVs, and an entire tower complex had to be evacuated. No officers were lost during the operation, but had it not been for the 2 Black Hawk helicopters with heavy machine guns providing air support, things could have gotten more dicier for law enforcement. Arturo Beltran Leyva. Amongst the top-tier traffickers, there are few names like the Beltran Leyvas that have cemented their names in the Hall of Infamy. The family has been involved in the business since the 80s, and possibly earlier. The organization was originally led by the oldest brother, Arturo. The core leadership consisted of Arturo and his 4 brothers. The brothers were certified bosses. By the mid-2000s, they were members of the Sinaloa cartel, directing multi-ton shipments on a weekly basis. Everything worked smoothly until 2008, when the Beltran brothers accused El Chapo of selling out one of their brothers in exchange for his own son's freedom. During the war, Arturo, like every other boss, began to move between safe houses across several states, like Guerrero and Colima. By December 2009, he was moving with several SUVs full of bodyguards. He directed the war against El Chapo, El Mayo, and Nacho Coronel from states like Morelos, where Arturo would meet his end. He had a reputation for aggressive moves and didn't hesitate to shoot first. Meanwhile, the war was still raging in Sinaloa and elsewhere. El Chapo and his allies were still alive and sending their own hit teams to take out El Barbas and his people. But even during those dicey times, life goes on. Those shipments still had to make their way north. It was December 11th, 2009. Arturo and his bodyguards drove over to a mansion he owned near Cuernavaca. He was hosting a Christmas party for his crew. More than 20 sultry women were hired for the night to entertain the guests. A couple well-known norteño bands were hired. The party was well underway when Arturo got a frantic phone call warning him of a convoy of naval special forces on their way to arrest him. Arturo was able to escape the area before the military could have the entire place sealed off. Several bodyguards were left behind to block anyone trying to pursue the boss, making his escape out the back. For almost a week, the military lost track of Arturo. Then on December 16, he was located based on info from a high-level informant. Some say it was La Barbie that gave up Arturo, but in any case, his location was now known. The military quickly organized a raid on his luxury condo in a tower complex in Cuernavaca. Not only did the military manage to surround Arturo without him noticing until it was too late, the Marines and Navy Special Forces successfully identified and neutralized his early warning network of taxi drivers and various lookouts. They usually placed themselves in concentric rings around the location of wherever Arturo was staying in. By the time the boss realized something was wrong, it was too late. He was surrounded. A shootout began when the first Marines reached Arturo's floor. His gunmen opened fire with automatic AK rifles. The crew had a good supply of grenades and ammo. Every time Marines tried to push up the stairs, Arturo's bodyguards opened up with everything. Among his loyal gunmen was one of his most trusted, Chalito Araujo. The young boss commanded his own hit team, engaged in a brutal street war with the opposing force. Then at night, a team of Marines landed on the rooftop of the tower. They made their way down to where Arturo was located. The two forces tightened the noose around the boss. By now, most of his gunmen were dead. Within minutes, his last bodyguard also went down. It was now Arturo alone against an overwhelming force. He could surrender and risk a long prison sentence with possible extradition. But in true Arturo fashion, he went out guns blazing. He didn't get too far. By the time it was over, Arturo's body lay by the entrance to the condo. A big chunk of his right shoulder was gone. The shootout left several gunmen dead, 4 bodyguards inside the condo with Arturo. But also among the dead were sicarios that made an attempt to rescue the boss. Several SUVs arrived near the towers during the operation. The sicarios began a furious attack on security forces surrounding the tower complex. They were trying to fight their way through a line of soldiers and federal police, but the authorities had more firepower and successfully repelled the attack. A notable incident happened after Arturo died. The sole Marine that died during the operation had part of his family wiped out by Zeta gunmen at the request of the Beltran Leivas. It was revenge, some say because Arturo's body was posed in a disrespectful manner by authorities, which was then photographed and published in newspapers across the country and the world. On October 17, 2019, National Guard agents would arrive at an upscale neighborhood in the Sinaloan capital of Culiacan. The agents were there to arrest a high-level boss of the Sinaloa cartel. It was none other than Ovidio Guzman, one of several brothers that took over the business after their father, El Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the U.S. There was no question who was in charge. Ivan Archivado Guzman was now the leader of the Chapitos faction. His brother Ovidio was right alongside his brothers, coordinating cartel business and living the high life. For the most part, the Sinaloa cartel doesn't confront the army or federal forces head on, but on October 17, the Sinaloa cartel, specifically the Chapitos forces, launched an all-out assault throughout Culiacan and ultimately rescued Ovidio. The fact that the operation took place at all is still a contested issue, since the brothers paid hefty bribes to several high-level government officials and had informants in key positions of the government. In any case, the National Guard commander got the word from higher-ups to raid a suspected safe house in a ritzy section of Culiacan. The unit commander didn't know exactly who was in the house. He just knew it was a mid-level to high-level target. A small convoy of National Guard troops made their way into the area and quickly surrounded a modern, upscale house. They began banging on the door and yelling for the inhabitants to surrender and come out peacefully. After some time, the door opens and Ovidio Guzman steps out, looking surprised but steady. He sensed the agents had not known whose house this actually was. The agents at first were the ones surrounding Ovidio, but it now became apparent they were the ones now being encircled. As soon as the first troops descended from their vehicles, lookouts alerted their commanders of the situation at the boss's house, and within minutes, the first cartel units began racing towards the area. Commanders like El Nini, El Chuta, and El Panu, and others activated their sicarios and began sending orders to block roads, bridges, and all entry points into and out of the city. As the National Guard unit realized getting out of the city was going to be impossible without backup, they told Ovidio to call his people and order them to back off. In a phone call Ovidio made to his brother Ivan, he told his brother to call off the gunmen that were now riding around in armored trucks with machine guns and rocket launchers, attacking army patrols throughout the city. Ovidio basically said, "It's okay, we'll have the lawyers get me out." out. Tell them to stand down. I gave myself up. After a moment of silence, Ivan responded, "Fuck that, we're breaking you out." And so, that's what it was. The brothers organized a fierce counterattack. They placed trucks with heavy machine guns near the airport to prevent planes from landing or taking off. They blocked the city's highways and bridges. No one was getting in or out, blocked roads with burning vehicles, and even kidnapped several military members. They held them as hostages to further pressure the government to release Ovidio. Hundreds of sicarios were roaming the city and the outskirts. A local army housing center was attacked. Soldiers were taking heavy fire from cartel gunmen throughout the city. One soldier ended up losing a leg from a direct hit from a 50 caliber rifle. Sicarios at one point were seen greeting soldiers manning a checkpoint, totally outgunned. The soldiers could only stand by as a swarm of heavily armed sicarios roamed around and stopped traffic. Finally, after several hours of chaos, Ovidio was released. His security came and picked up Ovidio and his family. The entire operation was poorly planned, with no reserve units as backup. The operation was speculated to be a politically motivated raid. Apparently, López Obrador was not made aware of the attempt to capture Ovidio that day. He only learned about the raid on TV, like the rest of the world. As for Los Chapitos, they learned a lesson from their father. Perhaps it's better to have a grave in Mexico than a cell in the US. They knew once the Mexican government had Ovidio in custody, it was only a matter of time before he was extradited to the US, and that was a scenario Ovidio's brothers were going to prevent at all costs. Antonio Cardenas was one of two main Gulf cartel bosses. His brother Ociel used to be in charge of the cartel until he was extradited to the US back in 2007. Tony was known as Tony Tormenta. He created his own rival squad of killers, known as Los Escorpiones. The group was tasked with the personal security of Tony and keeping control of Matamoros. Los Escorpiones were filled with military veterans. They were a powerful force, and one of the main groups fighting Los Zetas. That type of fearsome reputation would make any attempt to arrest Tony a real bloodbath. Tony had been captured before by an army unit. He was eventually released by the commander, who took a $3 million bribe. Tony was angered by how the soldiers had roughed him up while detained. After he was released, he kidnapped an entire squad of soldiers and demanded a ransom from the same commander that took the bribe. The commander refused, and the soldiers were killed. After this, the soldiers' comrades kidnapped one of Tony's wives and sons. The wife was roughed up and possibly violated, while the son was killed in front of the mother. During this escalating tit-for-tat situation, the Marine High Command got the word to go after Tony. His phone numbers were provided by an informant. A few days before the raid, authorities learned Tony would attend a family party in the downtown area of Matamoros. Los Escorpiones ran a tight security ring around Tony. Any conventional operation, with vehicles and helicopters approaching, would immediately sound the alarm. They had to figure out a way to surprise him. The Marines and Special Forces troops secretly moved into surrounding buildings, disguised as civilians. They moved equipment and personnel along a waterway near the neighborhood where Tony was scheduled to be in days later. On November 5th, 2010, Tony arrived with his bodyguards at his safe house. At around 3 o'clock p.m., Tony and his gunmen, all either military vets or former police, were standing outside the building, smoking and drinking some beers, when they noticed the Marines moving towards them. The group immediately opened up with automatic weapons and grenades. The Marines began to return fire. Tony and his bodyguards ran inside a nearby building and began to call up reinforcements. The group was barricaded inside. They were shooting everything they had at the government forces surrounding them. Tony knew the Marines would not accept a bribe. He was either going to surrender or die. That was, of course, if his loyal Escorpiones didn't show up to break open an escape route. Soon after the shootout began, backup began to arrive. Hundreds of Escorpiones gunmen were now attacking security forces manning the outer perimeter. Los Escorpiones had snipers on rooftops. They had armored trucks driving around ambushing Marines and police throughout the city. Blockades were quickly set up by Tony's men to prevent police backup from entering the city. Detonations were heard throughout and even across the border in Brownsville, Texas. Several times, Los Escorpiones got close to Tony, but were ultimately pushed back by Marines. After several hours, Tony and his men were now out of grenades, and they were down to their last magazines. Finally, the Marines closed in. They began to strafe the building he was in with 40mm grenade launchers. They flushed out Tony and his men into a side courtyard where Marines got close enough to shoot them at almost point-blank range. The shootout was one of the most destructive the country had ever seen. Streets were showered with explosions from grenades, and multiple buildings were damaged by gunfire. Dozens of vehicles were left burning on streets and highways, the result of Gulf Cartel sicarios engaging security forces that day. Schools and government buildings were closed for days. The government gave the official casualty figures. 4 cartel members, including Tony, were killed in the operation. 3 Marines were killed, with 4 wounded. Also, a local reporter was accidentally killed while speeding towards the action. Unofficially, though, several eyewitnesses that lived in the area claimed more than a dozen Marines lost their lives that day. Sicario deaths were rumored to be more than 50. By 2015, CJNG was on the move all over Mexico. They were expanding fast, and Mencho's name was now appearing more frequently around the world. His cartel was responsible for massive quantities of drugs heading north and around the world. CJNG ships tons of product into Europe, Asia, and Australia. All of this profit allowed CJNG units to ride into combat with the latest military gear, from automatic assault rifles with grenade launchers to 50 caliber machine guns. The cartel controlled Jalisco and other states with their 5 main combat units. The government was desperate to capture El Mencho. This cartel was responsible for a recent ambush of state police in Jalisco that had left 15 officers dead. CJNG was out of control and needed to be dealt with. Mexico's intelligence services were hunting Mencho for several weeks when they finally got a location on the billionaire boss of the cartel. But unfortunately for the government, CJNG had known for weeks about the upcoming operation. They knew El Mencho was a target, so they prepared. They trained their frontline troops on how and where to deploy when the operation began. Mencho's bodyguards in particular were well trained and motivated. They were all either military vets or former police. In the early morning hours of May 1st, 2015, Operation Jalisco began. There were numerous raids all over the state, but they focused on the south of Jalisco. Through electronic surveillance, they figured out that Mencho was in and around the town of Casimiro Castillo. They were going to flush him out. As soon as the operation began, bodyguards woke up the boss and rushed him to a waiting SUV. Part of a convoy of armored SUVs speeding towards Villa Purificación. They drove with no lights while using night vision goggles to avoid detection. Somewhere along a country road, the convoy was spotted by a nearby Air Force Cougar helicopter. A chase began with the chopper flying low, right behind the speeding cartel convoy. There was an exchange of gunfire. The gunmen were firing belt-fed machine guns at the helicopter. At one point, the chopper stopped to allow the troops inside to rope down. The first soldiers to jump out were hit with small arms fire from the convoy. The sicarios kept shooting and managed to hit and kill one of the pilots. At that moment, a couple gunmen took the opportunity to knock it out of the sky. Several sicarios fired rocket launchers. One round struck the helicopter's tail rotor. The chopper began to spin and eventually crashed into a wooded area. CJNG sicarios tried to finish off the surviving troops on the ground, but by then another helicopter arrived and began to strafe the sicarios approaching the crash site. Meanwhile, El Mencho and his convoy of heavily armed bodyguards disappeared into the night. This wasn't the only time El Mencho had gotten away. He was able to escape in operation at least 4 times in the past. The state was out-coordinated by CJNG commanders. The cartel had known about the operation for weeks. They had time to come up with ways to neutralize the raid. Their units were tasked with deceiving, delaying, and harassing law enforcement and the military units that were part of the operation. Important intersections and bridges were closed by blocking the path with a burning truck or bus. Troops and police were pinned down by ambushes. Businesses were set on fire. In the end, the government lost 10 members of the army and federal police. CJNG lost a similar number of gunmen, but it had accomplished its mission, and Mencho was able to escape. Soon after, the federal government sent a large team to secure the area. Nearby, they found several armored trucks. Some had heavy machine guns mounted in the back. The government was criticized for failing to capture any high-level CJNG members. The operation was also criticized for not coordinating more efficiently with the different agencies, which added to the state's slow response to events on the ground. According to eyewitnesses and Villa Purificación, several days later, army units entered the area and began to arrest people in town, accusing them of helping the cartel. Family members would later learn some of the arrested would later turn up dead at a nearby farm where a supposed shootout had occurred between the army and CJNG sicarios.